Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background, how this project started, it was actually Gabriela and I came together to create a whole nation branding concept for Slovakia. That was the governmental tender we were turned down for. So about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, Slovakia opened a competition up through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the first ever nation branding concept for Slovakia. Now, we were very relatively young, or one of the youngest nations in Europe. We didn't exist on the map of the continent until some 26 years ago. So this was a huge opportunity. We got really excited by this prospect, and we delved really, really deep into Slovak history, into the symbolism in our country, to find a concept and a brand and a slogan that would be really representational of Slovakia, of its potential in the future, but also honoring its past. Unfortunately, due to a bureaucratic error, we were kicked out of this competition, but we didn't let that get us down. Of course, there were some tears, or a lot of tears shed at the lost opportunity, but we did get back on our feet, and we channeled this research and knowledge into this book, which is Slovakia, the Legend of the Linden. This is what Gabriela and I refer to as a narrative of a nation. It tells Slovakia's story in its essence, through a kind of emotional visual imagery, and ultimately we tune into symbolism to communicate this journey, our country's journey throughout history, and of course we tune into one of the most sacred symbols in our region, which is the linden tree and its heart-shaped leaf. Before we begin, I just want to say that this tree is the national tree of Slovakia, and it is also the sacred tree of the Slavs.
And just to build on what Zuzana just so beautifully encapsulated, once we started digging into the depths of the symbolism, we realized that linden was not just important tree in Slovakia. It is a symbolism, and it is a cultural heritage that all Europeans share. So this is very exciting. This is something that connects us within Europe, but also beyond it. So let's begin. Sure. So let's just start on just to talk you briefly about what symbols are and why they're important, so that we are all on the same page on that.
So symbols, essentially, to put in the simplest terms, are codes. They're codes that anchor information. This information is interpreted by us on a conscious level, but also on a subconscious level. We have to remember that the written language, or writing, is a relatively new human innovation. If we look at the Slavic people, we can see that their language was spoken. It wasn't codified in written form until nearly the turn of the second millennium. So one vehicle we used to communicate information, knowledge, wisdom to one another was anchoring it in these codes, in these images, in these symbols. In today's modern era, or market-driven era, we see the application of symbols used for the purposes of representing businesses, corporations, companies, in the form of brands and logos. And if you look on this PowerPoint, you'll see on the left, everyone will recognize the swoosh. It's the Nike symbol. But it actually, it was called Nike, and it was designed in such a way because it was representational of the goddess Nike. She was the Greek goddess of victory. And we can see this kind of overlap with imagery. Symbols are, of course, not just used to represent businesses. They're also used to represent nations. They are very powerful vehicles to kind of communicate a country's story and what that country represents, but they're also used as images, as codes, as kind of totems to unify people, to create a sense of togetherness, to create a sense of identity. Of course, what we have also seen, and it's quite well documented in the modern era, we've seen the use that symbols can be used for good, but also for bad. So we've had instances in our history, particularly in the 20th century, where we've seen symbolism weaponized or actually abused to represent or to push forward certain agendas. So now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the symbolism of our region. and it actually goes back much beyond the Slavic tribes. One of the kind of first totems we found, thanks to archaeological studies, is the Venus icons. The one that you see in this image is actually the Venus of Moravia, but there's been numerous Venus icons throughout the region of Europe. And these date back 20,000 years to the time of the hunters and gatherers. They're actually quite miniature figures. If you've ever had the privilege to see one, they're absolutely magnificent. They certainly do carry certain power and energy. They're carved into mammoth bone. And they represent an ancient practice, an ancient civilization practice, which is that of worshiping the mother goddess. In this case, the Venus, the mother goddess energy, as personified in this kind of voluptuous form of the matriarchal power, the mother, the source of breast milk, the source of love, the source of abundance. And what's very interesting and what this presentation will unravel is this lineage continues today. We'll take that further.
So before we dig into even deeper, the ancient practice of worshipping Mother Goddess, it might sound a little foreign to you, but what it speaks of the people who owned this cult, who enacted this cult, the values that they enshrine and that they represented. So of our people in our region of Europe, it speaks of their love of harmony and peace. The predecessors of Slovaks, Czechs, and Polish, they were not necessarily the warriors. They were the people who preferred to live in peace and live in prosperity. And this legacy carried on when the Slavs came into the region around the 6th century. They continued this devotion to the peace, to the femininity, to the soft values, and represented it in their way. And this is where we begin to tap into a pan-European legacy that's not just for the Slavs. It's also there. It's also familiar to the Celts, who worshipped the Linden, because the Linden became to be symbolic of this femininity, of this prosperity, of this peace and harmony. Of course, it does have the heart-shaped leaf that has always evoked love and peace to people. And this symbol we find in cultures across Europe. So we begin here with Celts, for whom the tree symbolized fairness, but also victory. Actually, one of the earliest archaeological finds from Slovakia is this little Biatek coin that shows a king riding a stallion, victoriously holding a linden branch. Then we continue with the Romans. In the Roman mythology, the linden tree was actually ascribed to goddess Venus, the goddess of love, of beauty, of youth, but also to goddess Unona, who was the goddess of wisdom. So this marries that wisdom and the love in the Roman mythology and Roman imagery into actually a lot of beautiful myths and practices. One of them is of the linden as this personification of love and wisdom, that young couples, of marital love and of fidelity, of purity. And young couples used to decorate their home shrines with linden branches to bring in this kind of love, pure, real love into their lives. And also when Romans were celebrating a feast of the goddess of fertility, young maidens would adorn themselves with crowns made of linden flowers. This is very similar for ancient Greeks, who also believed that the linden was a symbol of femininity and a symbol of love. We find several tales in the Greek mythology that refer to linden. One of them is a story of Baucis and Philemon. It's this elderly couple who love each other so deeply they do not even want to part ways after their death. And gods reward them for this love and for their good deeds. by turning them into trees. She turns into a linden, and he turns into an oak. Their branches and their roots intertwine as a symbol of eternal love. There is also another tale that speaks of Linden that related to a fairy called Philira, who had an affair with the god Kronos, out of which a centaur was born. And when he was born, so this is centaur is the mythological creature that has a body of horse and a head of a human. When the centaur is born, Philira, the fairy, turns into Linden. Again, the tree that represents women, femininity, love. Greeks also ascribed the tree to the goddess Aphrodite because of the sweet smell of the linden flowers. And then we have here Germanic peoples who are perhaps the closest to our region, who also worship the linden as the tree of love, of fairness, of purity, of truth. There is actually evidence that suggests that people would gather under the linden trees. They would hold ceremonies, they would dance to the linden trees on important occasions. And they also associated linden with truth and jurisprudence. So up until Middle Ages, across Germany, people would hold tribunals under the linden trees because they believed the tree would make people speak the truth. So this is a ritual or a tradition that died out not very long ago, actually. So it testifies of the long legacy of the linden in Europe.
Now, focusing on more recent history, particularly the Slavic region, which is the genetic cultural heritage lineage that where the present-day Slovaks and Czechs are most connected to, we see that the Slavs actually worship the tree. Again, this continuation of representing the divine feminine, the female face of God. The Slavs were a pagan people. They worshipped divinity in nature. They associated particularly the linden tree with the goddess Lada. And like Gabriela said, the Slavic goddess Lada, the linden tree, was equivalent to the Greek goddess Aphrodite and the Roman goddess Venus. The tree represented the cycle of life. According to the Hermetic principle, it was they revered it as a symbol of as above, so below, as within, so without. It was very much cherished by them as also a protector of the people, protector of the tribe. They believed that the linden tree could not be struck by lightning, so they sought its shelter during storms. When Great Moravia was erected, which was the first Slavic state in Europe, it actually was even established even before the Kievan Rus. The linden tree was a very important place for gatherings and also for making for important decision-making positions. That's where Gabriela will take over.
So the entire spiritual, cultural, but also political life of Great Moravia. So this is an ancient Slavic state that comprised parts of modern-day Slovakia, Czech Republic, but also Poland. So life here revolved around the linden tree. Linden trees represented meeting places and cultural centers. As Zuzana said, these were important gatherings that decided matters of the state were held because it was believed to be protected, because it was believed to be a symbol of peace. So in this name, our predecessors wanted to make their decisions. And because Slavs were pagan people, they did not have churches as we know them today. Instead, they prayed in nature. And because the linden was so dear to their hearts, it was their special tree, they would have sacred linden groves where they would go to worship, where they would go to pray. And this legacy slightly altered with the arrival of Christianity into the region in the 9th century.
So this was Christianity arrived via the emissaries, the Byzantine emissaries, Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius. They came to our region to finally convert the Slavs to Christianity. By then, much of Europe was already Christian. The Slavic people, on the other hand, were pagan, or what the Romans referred to as barbar or barbarian. So Cyril and Methodius came and they started to study the culture, the local culture of the people. They started to study the language. They started to study the belief systems and the practices. And they noted certain habits that the Slavs expressed, which was, as Gabriela said, worshiping divinity in nature, going to seek connection with God in these linden groves. So in order to mobilize the conversion of mindsets or the conversion of belief systems or make Christianity appealing to the local people, they sought points of convergence between Christian belief and pagan belief. And one of those was the Virgin Mary. So the Virgin Mary she's referred to in the Bible as the goddess of the universe. So again, we see a parallel there with representing the female aspect of God, the female face of God. So we saw the linden tree, the goddess Lada, being actually slowly transitioned into the iconography of the Virgin Mary. Secondly, we saw churches being established in linden groves to honor the practice of the Slavic people, of the pagan people. Where new churches were erected and there were no groves around, lindens were planted, again, to facilitate this overlap between belief systems. And this is something that Gabriela and I actually find very fascinating throughout our region. If you drive throughout Slovakia, particularly the central part and the eastern part of the country, it's really hard to find a church, particularly an ancient church, that doesn't have a linden tree planted next to it. So this is a very kind of living memory and an example of how the cultural practices of the past don't just die out. They often transmute. Perhaps they have a different name. Perhaps we no longer recognize them, but they're still there with us.
Well, we'd like to play you here a short video that is presenting one of those special trees, special lindens in Slovakia that we believe is very representational of what we've just been talking about, but also the legacy of the linden.
And maybe you should introduce it also, how it's one tree.
Yes, this video was created a few months ago when we in Europe had a competition called the European Tree of the Year. And this ancient 800 years old, 800?
I think it's much younger. I think it's
like
200 something.
It's several centuries old anyway. Linden in Western Slovakia was a contestant. And what's interesting about it is that it grows right next to the oldest Christian church in Central Eastern Europe.
Slovakia may be a young country, but the Slovaks are an old people. Their dramatic journey began long before the dawn of Christianity.
Kopčany sú dverami do starodávnej histórie Slovanov a Slovákov. Tu môžeme stále cítiť tep Veľkej Moravy, najstaršieho slovanského štátu na svete, ktorý bol založený ešte pred Kyjevskou Rusou.
Slovaks are the descendants of the ancient Slavs, a people that practice a pagan religion. Theirs was one of worshiping divinity in nature. They had a religion of tree gods. The linden was personified by the goddess Lada, equivalent to the Greek Aphrodite and the Roman Venus. She was the embodiment of nature's abundance and sensuality.
Keď prišiel Cyril a Metod do tohto regiónu na Veľkú Moravu, aby pokresťančili, potrebovali obyvateľstvo obrátiť na novú vieru rýchlo. V posvetných slovanských hájoch, kam boli ľudia zvyknutí chodiť sa modliť, postavili nové kostoly. tam, kde neboli posvätné háje, vedľa nových kostolov zasadili lipy.
And this living, beautiful tree connects the modern people of this country to the cultural heritage of their ancient Slavic predecessors.
Nezabudnite voliť za našu krásnu kopčiansku lipu. V ankete The European Tree of the Year máte čas do konca februára.
So the competition is over, and sadly, the Slovak Linden didn't win it. But its story certainly captured hearts of people across Europe, and it was a wonderful opportunity for Slovakia, but also for the region to showcase its oldest history and its oldest roots.
And this competition was actually very popular. Some 300,000 Europeans participated in voting for European Tree of the Year. So we're very happy to have contributed to that.
And it's beautiful to see just how close Europeans still are to the symbol of the tree. I mean, it's something that's universal to us, which we believe it's a bridge that we need to tend to, and then we need to strengthen in today's challenging times. And why not through these beautiful trees that produce oxygen for us, as well as speak of our heritage. So as Zuzana said before, this legacy of the linden tree is very much still alive in the region today, in some parts more, in some parts less. In the past, our predecessors believed that the linden would protect them from any harm, which is why cradles for babies were carved from the linden wood to assure they would have calm sleep. But also coffins were made of linden wood to ensure safe passage of the souls to the afterworld. Today, lindens still symbolize this cycle of life. People still plant lindens on the occasion of a child's birth. Usually it's the occasion of a girl's birth specifically. And we still find lindens in cemeteries to soothe people, also in this sad aspects of life. In the past, people used to plant lindens near water to purify it, so we still find a lot of lindens planted along streams and rivers. Lindens were planted at important occasions of a nation, a community, or a family. This is still the case. For instance, Slovak ambassadors still plant linden trees on their missions abroad as a gift of Slovakia to the world, as a message of peace and love from the heart of Europe. In the past, people liked to plant linden trees next to their homes because they believed it would protect them from any negativity and from any evil spirits. We still find those lindens there because up until recently, chopping down a linden tree was considered very bad luck, not just for the individual, but also for the family and for the community, which is actually a remnant of a much older tradition, pre-Christian tradition, when people believed that chopping down a linden was a cardinal sin, so a big no-no. You would mess with the gods if you did that. Also, because the linden is such a soothing tree, because it has its heart-shaped leaves, people believe that it was a healing tree. So this is where ill people gather and hope to obtain healing. And today we still find lots of lindens planted around hospitals to facilitate the same kind of healing today. And lastly, there is the linden tea. That is the favorite drink in the region, not just in Slovakia, but in the Czech Republic and in Poland. And it's the drink of choice that we go to when we feel under the weather, when we feel sick, when we're upset. This drink has calming effects. It soothes us and calms us down. So again, this builds on the ancient symbolism in a more physical, in a more material and immediate way. And it's a tradition, it's a belief that's still alive in the region, although most people practice this, drinking of the tea, etc., without being aware how deep the symbolism and the meaning of it actually goes. And the linden tree is Slovak national tree, as Zuzana already mentioned at the beginning, but it's also the national tree of the Czech Republic. and it's also the national tree of the Slovenians. So again, it's something that connects us in a very beautiful way.
And so now we're going to kind of move forward to the 20th century, to the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have to remember that Slovakia was part of northern Hungary, was a territory referred to as Northern Hungary for almost a millennia. After World War I, we saw actually 4 empires collapse in Europe, and we saw Czechoslovakia emerge in the heart of Europe. And it was the rising of a phoenix of, again, a Slavic state, and we're able to see some historical parallels. Now, these are not commonly stated in the mainstream, but we can see that Great Moravia was a unification of Czech and Slovakia, and also included parts of Slovenia and Poland. And some 1,000 years later, we saw the erection of this brethren kind of unity nation between Slavs, in this case the Czechs and the Slovaks. Now, Thomas Masaryk was very clever in employing narratives and also symbolism in justifying the existence of Czechoslovakia. Now, we may take the establishment of Czechoslovakia for granted today, but back then it was very iffy. The country was not necessarily recognized by its neighbors. It was also not predominantly Slavic. At the time, there were some 3 million Germans living on the territory. There were many hundreds of thousands of Hungarians living on the territory. So again, it was not necessarily clearly ethnic a pool, but Masaryk wanted to create unity between the Czechs and Slovaks, and he mobilized symbolism. In this case, he erected the Linden tree. He put it on our money, he put it on our monuments, he put it on ministries, and not only that, not only in visual representation, he had various missions going around the territory planting linden trees to commemorate the establishment of the Slavic Republic, and also to mark it as a tree of freedom, as a liberalization of the Slavs, of the Western Slavs. And we saw this practice, or this ritual of planting trees, being repeated again on the 10th anniversary of the establishment of Czechoslovakia, and also in 1968 during the Prague Spring. Most recently, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation, we saw an erection of this practice of planting lindens throughout the world, but predominantly in the Czech and Slovak territories to commemorate the 100 years since the establishment of the Republic in the heart of Europe.
So 1918 resurrected the symbol of the linden when it became the symbol of Czechoslovakia, both to the outside world and to the Czechoslovaks themselves. But prior to that, a few decades before that, the linden already became a symbol of awakening of the Slavs in the region. We were parts of Poland, Czech Republic and Slovakia were parts of Austria-Hungary, and there were tendencies to suppress the Slavic cultures, Slavic languages. And when it got so bad that the culture was nearly annihilated, these nations in the heart of Europe rose up under the flag of the linden tree. And we find the evidence of that in this beautiful poem from 1921 that I would like to recite to you. Tell me, thou tree, the temple of nature, under whose shadow they to primeval gods offerings formerly burned. Where are these nations, and where are their princes, and where are their cities? They who the first in the north called into being this life, they taught the use of sails and oars to indigent Europe, taught how to sail over the sea, passing to beautiful shores. Out of the oar-laden depths they dug the metals concealed there. More from respect for the gods, rather than profit to men, they taught the farmer to till the bosom of the earth with the plowshare, so that the lands that were buried with the golden hued corn, they by the peaceful paths, the lime tree sacred to Slava, planted and scattered around fragrance and shadowy rest. So here we see gradually, our ancestors, the more immediate ones, were exploring too the ancient symbolism and the importance of it until they resurrected it to the present form in 1918 when Czechoslovakia was founded. But the Linden is not just exclusive to the Czechs and the Slovaks. We find it has a very special place and meaning in the Polish culture too. We will cover this very briefly because you have a presentation specifically on that coming up. So in Poland, the Linden was revered as the tree of victory. Many towns, cities, and villages across Poland were named after the Linden. And even the month of July got its name from the linden, Lipiec. In addition to that, Polish were mass planting lindens after great victories and after peace treaties were signed. One of the most famous eras and occasions of this happening was in the 17th century when Vienna was nearly this part of the region, or chunks of it were occupied by the Ottomans, and Vienna came under the threat in the 17th century as the Ottomans were approaching to invade the capital of a centuries-old empire. It was the Polish king who managed to defeat them and push them back, which marked the beginning of the liberation of Europe from the Ottoman rule. And in the memory of that, and to celebrate this moment of glory and victory, Polish planted lots of linden trees across Poland. And also some of the oldest Polish poetry, a poem that dates back to the 16th century, also speaks of the beauty and of the enchantment of the people of this region with the linden. So I would like to read you an excerpt from that too. Traveler, come under my leaves for a rest where the sun will not reach you. Come and I promise the best, even with sun at the highest, shooting down on the meadow's brilliant rays. Diffuse them I shall to the softest of shadows. Here, right under my crown, wafts gently a cooling breeze. Here the starlings and larks all abound and argue with ease. Here the hard-working bees extract from my sweetest smelling flower honey that graces the finest of tables at family hour, and without effort, with whispers that come from my deep, I shall be summoning all visitors sweetly to sleep. Though in Hesperides' garden none of the apples I bear, as the most giving of trees my Lord has planted me there. So again, here we see the notions of peace, of tranquility, of abundance, going back several centuries to remind us of just how important, how revered, and how special this tree was to the Polish people. So now we would like, having briefly talked you through a millennia-old story of the linden in Central Eastern Europe, we picked several of these remarkable trees in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, and in Poland to demonstrate this on. So we begin with Slovakia.
So yeah, we begin with Slovakia here in Bojnica Castle. You might have already heard of this castle. It's one of the most romantic kind of Disney tale castles in Central Europe. There's a beautiful linden tree that stands in the castle estate's courtyard. It's very much celebrated by locals and tourists alike. Many people like to stand next to it and take pictures during certain parts of the year. There's also rituals that are played out with school children, holding hands around the tree and singing songs. And the myth of its planting actually goes back to the Hungarian king, King Matthias Corvinus. At the time, again, like we said earlier, Slovakia was part of northern Hungary, so the nobility was all Hungarian, and they had actually quite a bit of castles and estates scattered around the territory. And King Matthew was very much liked by the locals for honoring the practices of the Slavs or the Slovaks, and which is why the myth says that he planted this linden tree in the courtyard of the estate to honor kind of the belief systems that were indigenous to the people in the region, and to honor the cultural identity. Next, we have these Liberty Groves, linden tree groves, and these were planted across the country, particularly on the 10th anniversary of the establishment of Czechoslovakia. And it's very interesting to see that the Masaryk government sent out a brief to plant linden trees to commemorate the decade, of this new state. And in the Czech Republic, they were planted as single trees, as per the instructions on the brief. And in Slovakia, we can't quite explain why, but instead of planting individual linden trees, the Slovaks planted groves. So these are referred to as freedom groves. And it's very interesting to see that the Slovaks opted to kind of enact this ancient practice going back to their Slavic predecessors, to their arrival in the 6th century AD into Central Europe, where they would connect with God, where they would connect with divinity through these linden groves. So once again, we can see how history overlaps.
And many of them have been forgotten, but many of them can be visited and admired in Slovakia still today.
And Gabriela, you actually went to one.
Yes, I actually found one. Just near my hometown. There is this small town of Šaštín Stráže, which is an important Christian pilgrim site, but it's also a home to one of these Liberty Groves from 1928 that most people have sadly forgotten about, which is also down to the fact that, when the Second World War erupted and Slovakia was a satellite state of Nazi Germany, it was the government policy to cut these groves down so as to make people forget, so as to get them on the side of the occupiers, of the Germans. And it actually worked to an extent. Very few people remember this activity and these groves today. But we're doing our best to bring it back to public memory.
And I'm actually curious, was there signage around that linden grove?
Yes.
Which actually said 1920.
Yes.
How interesting.
So we continue with the Czech Republic. Here you can see Vedas linden. It's actually the tree with the thickest trunk in the country. It's hard to tell how old it is. It's estimated that it was planted sometime after the 12th century, so it's pretty old. Its trunk is big enough to hold a table and 4 chairs, and there is also a myth that surrounds this tree, as important emblems usually do. So the linden occupies a very prominent space in public imagery and folk tales. And this particular one, there is a legend that says there is a ghost of a boy haunting the tree. Or there was a ghost of a boy haunting the tree who fell in there centuries ago and died there, did not manage to get out. And people say that this ghost was released in the early 20th century when the hollow of the tree opened to release the trapped soul. And we continue with more recent and happier memory. Last year we celebrated 100th anniversary of Czechoslovakia, and on that occasion a Czech-led initiative decided to revive the old traditions and map out the liberty trees from planted during the era of First Czechoslovakia, but also planting new ones to remind people of the importance of freedom and brotherhood and peace. And at an iconic spot in the Czech Republic, which is the Reed Mountain, it's like the Mecca to the Czechs. Also a very special place in their local mythology. They believe that this is where Father Czech came to, and this is the place where we decided to settle down in the region. So these are the origins of the Czech nation. So this is where the initiative on the 100th anniversary of Czechoslovakia planted 100 new lindens and essentially created another linden grove or linden alley. So again, we can see the ancient tradition of the ancient Slavs going back a millennium, reenacted today, hopefully to last centuries into the future.
And I just want to say, you were also present there, and you planted a tree on
yes,
our behalf.
So we have a tree there that bears the name Lada. And it was planted with much love and hope for the future. And we have here Poland. I already mentioned King John Sobieski, or King Jan. So after his great victory at Vienna, saving Europe from the Ottomans, he too is believed to have planted lindens at his estate in Warsaw, at Wilanov's palace, and some of them are still there, beautifully taken care of. So when you're next in Warsaw, have a look at these historic lindens that are reminders of the glorious past of this country and this nation. And then there is another tree, which is perhaps more humble, but nonetheless more beautiful. And it's a throwback to the ancient cult of Mother Goddess, of Lada, and of Virgin Mary. In this several hundred centuries old tree, people built a shrine to Virgin Mary. And people in this part of Poland still believe that prayers that are spoken under the linden tree are more likely to be listened to and fulfilled because the linden is the favorite tree of Virgin Mary.